The body of the nation. But the basin of the Mississippi is the body of the nation. All the other parts are but members, important in themselves, yet more important in their relations to this. Exclusive of the lake basin and of 300,000 square miles in Texas and New Mexico, which in many aspects form a part of it, this basin contains about 1,250,000 square miles. In extent it is the second great valley of the world, being exceeded only by that of the Amazon. The valley of the frozen Obi approaches it in extent. That of La Plata comes next in space and probably in habitable capacity, having about 8/9 of its area. Then comes that of the Yenisei with about 7/9, the Lena, Amur, Hongho, Yangtze-Kiang and Nile 5/9, the Ganges less than 1/2, the Indus less than 1/3, the Euphrates 1/5, the Rhine 1/15. It exceeds in extent the whole of Europe, exclusive of Russia, Norway and Sweden. It would contain Austria 4 times, Germany or Spain 5 times, France 6 times, the British Islands or Italy 10 times. Conceptions formed from the river basins of Western Europe are rudely shocked when we consider the extent of the valley of the Mississippi. Nor are those formed from the sterile basins of the great rivers of Siberia, the lofty plateaus of Central Asia, or the mighty sweep of the swampy Amazon more adequate. Latitude, elevation, and rainfall all combine to render every part of the Mississippi Valley capable of supporting a dense population. As a dwelling place for civilized man, it is by far the first upon our globe. Editor's Table, Harper's Magazine, February 1863. Chapter 1. The River and its History. The Mississippi is well worth reading about. It is not a commonplace river, but on the contrary is in all ways remarkable. Considering the Missouri its main branch, it is the longest river in the world, 4,300 miles. It seems safe to say that it is also the crookedest river in the world, since in one part of its journey it uses up 1,300 miles to cover the same ground that the crow would fly over in 675. It discharges 3 times as much water as the St. Lawrence, 25 times as much as the Rhine, and 338 times as much as the Thames. No other river has so vast a drainage basin. It draws its water supply from 28 states and territories, from Delaware on the Atlantic seaboard, and from all the country between that and Idaho on the Pacific slope, a spread of 45 degrees of longitude. The Mississippi receives and carries to the Gulf water from 54 subordinate rivers that are navigable by steamboats, and from some hundreds that are navigable by flats and keels. The area of its drainage basin is as great as the combined areas of England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, Austria, Italy, and Turkey, and almost all this wide region is fertile. The Mississippi Valley proper is exceptionally so. It is a remarkable river in this, that instead of widening toward its mouth it grows narrower and deeper. From the junction of the Ohio to a point halfway down to the sea, the width averages a mile in high water. Thence to the sea the width steadily diminishes, until at the passes, above the mouth, it is but little over half a mile. At the junction of the Ohio the Mississippi's depth is 87 feet. The depth increases gradually, reaching 129 just above the mouth. The difference in rise and fall is also remarkable, not in the upper but in the lower river. The rise is tolerably uniform down to Natchez, 360 miles above the mouth, about 50 feet. But at Bayou La Fourche the river rises only 24 feet, at New Orleans only 15, and just above the mouth only 2 1/2. An article in the New Orleans Times-Democrat, based upon reports of able engineers, states that the river annually empties 406 million tons of mud into the Gulf of Mexico, which brings to mind Captain Marryat's rude name for the Mississippi, the Great Sewer. This mud, solidified, would make a mass a mile square and 241 feet high. The mud deposit gradually extends the land, but only gradually. It has extended it not quite a third of a mile in the 200 years which have elapsed since the river took its place in history. The belief of the scientific people is that the mouth used to be at Baton Rouge, where the hills cease, and that the 200 miles of land between there and the Gulf was built by the river. This gives us the age of that piece of country, without any trouble at all, 120,000 years. Yet it is much the youthfulest batch of country that lies around there anywhere. The Mississippi is remarkable in still another way. Its disposition to make prodigious jumps by cutting through narrow necks of land, and thus straightening and shortening itself. More than once it has shortened itself 30 miles at a single jump. These cut-offs have had curious effects. They have thrown several river towns out into the rural districts, and built up sandbars and forests in front of them. The town of Delta used to be 3 miles below Vicksburg. A recent cutoff has radically changed the position, and Delta is now 2 miles above Vicksburg. Both of these river towns have been retired to the country by that cutoff. A cutoff plays havoc with boundary lines and jurisdictions. For instance, a man is living in the state of Mississippi today, a cutoff occurs tonight, and tomorrow the man finds himself and his land over on the other side of the river, within the boundaries and subject to the laws of the state of Louisiana. Such a thing, happening in the upper river in the old times, could have transferred a slave from Missouri to Illinois and made a free man of him. The Mississippi does not alter its locality by cutoffs alone. It is always changing its habitat bodily, is always moving bodily sidewise. At hard times, the river is 2 miles west of the region it used to occupy. As a result, the original site of that settlement is not now in Louisiana at all, but on the other side of the river in the state of Mississippi. Nearly the whole of that 1,300 miles of old Mississippi River which La Salle floated down in his canoes 200 years ago is good solid dry ground now. The river lies to the right of it in places, and to the left of it in other places. Although the Mississippi's mud builds land but slowly down at the mouth, where the Gulf's billows interfere with its work, it builds fast enough in better protected regions higher up. For instance, Prophet's Island contained 1,500 acres of land 30 years ago. Since then the river has added 700 acres to it. But enough of these examples of the mighty stream's eccentricities for the present. I will give a few more of them further along in the book. Let us drop the Mississippi's physical history and say a word about its historical history, so to speak. We can glance briefly at its slumberous first epoch in a couple of short chapters, at its second and wider-awake epoch in a couple more, at its flushest and widest-awake epoch in a good many succeeding chapters, and then talk about its comparatively tranquil present epoch in what shall be left of the book. The world and the books are so accustomed to use, and overuse the word new in connection with our country, that we early get and permanently retain the impression that there is nothing old about it. We do of course know that there are several comparatively old dates in American history, but the mere figures convey to our minds no just idea, no distinct realization, of the stretch of time which they represent. To say that De Soto, the first white man who ever saw the Mississippi River, saw it in 1542, is a remark which states a fact without interpreting it. It is something like giving the dimensions of a sunset by astronomical measurements, and cataloguing the colors by their scientific names. As a result, you get the bold fact of the sunset, but you don't see the sunset. It would have been better to paint a picture of it. The date 1542, standing by itself, means little or nothing to us, but when one groups a few neighboring historical dates and facts around it, he adds perspective and color, and then realizes that this is one of the American dates which is quite respectable for age. For instance, when the Mississippi was first seen by a white man, less than a quarter of a century had elapsed since Francis I's defeat at Pavia, the death of Raphael, the death of Bayard sans pour et sans reproche, the driving out of the Knights Hospitallers from Rhodes by the Turks, and the placarding of the 95 Propositions, the act which began the Reformation. When De Soto took his glimpse of the river, Ignatius Loyola was an obscure name. The order of the Jesuits was not yet a year old. Michelangelo's paint was not yet dry on the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. Mary Queen of Scots was not yet born, but would be before the year closed. Catherine de' Medici was a child. Elizabeth of England was not yet in her teens. Calvin, Benvenuto Cellini, and the Emperor Charles V were at the top of their fame, and each was manufacturing history after his own peculiar fashion. Margaret of Navarre was writing the Heptameron and some religious books. The first survives, the others are forgotten, wit and indelicacy being sometimes better literature preservers than holiness. Lax court morals and the absurd chivalry business were in full feather, and the joust and the tournament were the frequent pastime of titled fine gentlemen who could fight better than they could spell, while religion was the passion of their ladies, and classifying their offspring into children of full rank and children by brevet their pastime. In fact, all around, religion was in a peculiarly blooming condition. The Council of Trent was being called, the Spanish Inquisition was roasting and racking and burning with a free hand. Elsewhere on the continent the nations were being persuaded to holy living by the sword and fire. In England Henry Roman VIII had suppressed the monasteries, burnt Fisher and another bishop or two, and was getting his English Reformation and his harem effectively started. When De Soto stood on the banks of the Mississippi, it was still 2 years before Luther's death, 11 years before the burning of Servetus, 30 years before the St. Bartholomew slaughter, Rabelais was not yet published, Don Quixote was not yet written, Shakespeare was not yet born. 100 long years must still elapse before Englishmen would hear the name of Oliver Cromwell. Unquestionably, the discovery of the Mississippi is a datable fact which considerably mellows and modifies the shiny newness of our country, and gives her a most respectable outside aspect of rustiness and antiquity. De Soto merely glimpsed the river, then died and was buried in it by his priests and soldiers. One would expect the priests and the soldiers to multiply the river's dimensions by 10, the Spanish custom of the day, and thus move other adventurers to go at once and explore it. On the contrary, their narratives when they reached home did not excite that amount of curiosity. The Mississippi was left unvisited by whites during a term of years, which seems incredible in our energetic days. One may sense the interval to his mind after a fashion by dividing it up in this way. After De Soto glimpsed the river, a fraction short of a quarter of a century elapsed, and then Shakespeare was born, lived a trifle more than half a century, then died, and when he had been in his grave considerably more than half a century, the second white man saw the Mississippi. In our day we don't allow 130 years to elapse between glimpses of a marvel. If somebody should discover a creek in the county next to the one that the North Pole is in, Europe and America would start 15 costly expeditions thither, one to explore the creek, and the other 14 to hunt for each other. For more than 150 years, there had been white settlements on our Atlantic coasts. These people were in intimate communication with the Indians. In the south the Spaniards were robbing, slaughtering, enslaving and converting them. Higher up, the English were trading beads and blankets to them for a consideration, and throwing in civilization and whiskey, for lagniappe. And in Canada the French were schooling them in a rudimentary way, missionarying among them, and drawing whole populations of them at a time to Quebec, and later to Montreal to buy furs of them. Necessarily then, these various clusters of whites must have heard of the great river of the far west, and indeed they did hear of it vaguely, so vaguely and indefinitely, that its course, proportions, and locality were hardly even guessable. The mere mysteriousness of the matter ought to have fired curiosity and compelled exploration, but this did not occur. Apparently nobody happened to want such a river, nobody needed it, nobody was curious about it, so, for a century and a half the Mississippi remained out of the market and undisturbed. When De Soto found it, he was not hunting for a river, and had no present occasion for one. Consequently he did not value it or even take any particular notice of it. But at last La Salle the Frenchman conceived the idea of seeking out that river and exploring it. It always happens that when a man seizes upon a neglected and important idea, people inflamed with the same notion crop up all around. It happened so in this instance. Naturally the question suggests itself, why did these people want the river now when nobody had wanted it in the 5 preceding generations? Apparently it was because at this late day, they thought they had discovered a way to make it useful, for it had come to be believed that the Mississippi emptied into the Gulf of California, and therefore afforded a short cut from Canada to China. Previously the supposition had been that it emptied into the Atlantic, or Sea of Virginia. Chapter 2. The River and its Explorers. La Salle himself sued for certain high privileges, and they were graciously accorded him by Louis Roman XIV of inflated memory. Chief among them was the privilege to explore far and wide and build forts and stake out continents and hand the same over to the king and pay the expenses himself, receiving in return some little advantages of one sort or another, among them the monopoly of buffalo hides. He spent several years and about all of his money in making perilous and painful trips between Montreal and a fort which he had built on the Illinois, before he at last succeeded in getting his expedition in such a shape that he could strike for the Mississippi. And meantime other parties had had better fortune. In 1673 Joliet the merchant and Marquette the priest crossed the country and reached the banks of the Mississippi. They went by way of the Great Lakes, and from Green Bay in canoes by way of Fox River and the Wisconsin. Marquette had solemnly contracted on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception that if the Virgin would permit him to discover the great river, he would name it Conception in her honor. He kept his word. In that day all explorers traveled with an outfit of priests. De Soto had 24 with him. La Salle had several also. The expeditions were often out of meat and scant of clothes, but they always had the furniture and other requisites for the mass. They were always prepared, as one of the quaint chroniclers of the time phrased it, to explain hell to the savages. On the 17th of June, 1673, the canoes of Joliet and Marquette and their 5 subordinates reached the junction of the Wisconsin with the Mississippi. Mr. Parkman says, before them, a wide and rapid current coursed athwart their way by the foot of lofty heights wrapped thick in forests. He continues, turning southward, they paddled down the stream, through a solitude unrelieved by the faintest trace of man. A big catfish collided with Marquette's canoe and startled him, and reasonably enough, for he had been warned by the Indians that he was on a foolhardy journey, and even a fatal one, for the river contained a demon, whose roar could be heard at a great distance, and who would engulf them in the abyss where he dwelt. I have seen a Mississippi catfish that was more than 6 feet long, and weighed 250 pounds, and if Marquette's fish was the fellow to that one, he had a fair right to think the river's roaring demon was come. At length the buffalo began to appear, grazing in herds on the great prairies which then bordered the river, and Marquette describes the fierce and stupid look of the old bulls as they stared at the intruders through the tangled mane which nearly blinded them. The voyagers moved cautiously, landed at night and made a fire to cook their evening meal, then extinguished it, embarked again, paddled some way farther and anchored in the stream, keeping a man on the watch till morning. They did this day after day and night after night, and at the end of 2 weeks they had not seen a human being. The river was an awful solitude then, and it is now over most of its stretch. But at the close of the fortnight, they one day came upon the footprints of men in the mud of the western bank, a Robinson Crusoe experience which carries an electric shiver with it yet, when one stumbles on it in print. They had been warned that the river Indians were as ferocious and pitiless as the river demon, and destroyed all comers without waiting for provocation. But no matter, Joliet and Marquette struck into the country to hunt up the proprietors of the tracks. They found them by and by, and were hospitably received and well treated, if to be received by an Indian chief who has taken off his last rag in order to appear at his level best, is to be received hospitably, and if to be treated abundantly to fish, porridge, and other game including dog, and have these things forked into one's mouth by the ungloved fingers of Indians, is to be well treated. In the morning the chief and 600 of his tribesmen escorted the Frenchmen to the river, and bade them a friendly farewell. 109k. On the rocks above the present city of Alton, they found some rude and fantastic Indian paintings which they describe. A short distance below, a torrent of yellow mud rushed furiously athwart the calm blue current of the Mississippi, boiling and surging and sweeping in its coarse logs, branches, and uprooted trees. This was the mouth of the Missouri, that savage river, which, descending from its mad career through a vast unknown of barbarism, poured its turbid floods into the bosom of its gentle sister. By and by they passed the mouth of the Ohio, they passed cane brakes, they fought mosquitoes, they floated along day after day, through the deep silence and loneliness of the river, drowsing in the scant shade of makeshift awnings and broiling with the heat. They encountered and exchanged civilities with another party of Indians, and at last they reached the mouth of the Arkansas, about a month out from their starting point, where a tribe of war-whooping savages swarmed out to meet and murder them. But they appealed to the Virgin for help, so in place of a fight there was a feast, and plenty of pleasant palaver and falderal. They had proved to their satisfaction that the Mississippi did not empty into the Gulf of California or into the Atlantic. They believed it emptied into the Gulf of Mexico. They turned back now and carried their great news to Canada. But belief is not proof. It was reserved for La Salle to furnish the proof. He was provokingly delayed by one misfortune after another, but at last got his expedition under way at the end of the year 1681. In the dead of winter, he and Henry de Tonty, son of Lorenzo Tonty, who invented the tontine, his lieutenant, started down the Illinois, with a following of 18 Indians brought from New England and 23 Frenchmen. They moved in procession down the surface of the frozen river on foot, and dragging their canoes after them on sledges. At Peoria Lake they struck open water, and paddled thence to the Mississippi and turned their prows southward. They plowed through the fields of floating ice, past the mouth of the Missouri, past the mouth of the Ohio by and by, and, gliding by the wastes of bordering swamp, landed on the 24th of February near the 3rd Chickasaw Bluffs, where they halted and built Fort Prudhomme. Again, says Mr. Parkman, they embarked, and with every stage of their adventurous progress, the mystery of this vast new world was more and more unveiled. More and more they entered the realms of spring. The hazy sunlight, the warm and drowsy air, the tender foliage, the opening flowers, betokened the reviving life of nature. Day by day they floated down the great bends, in the shadow of the dense forests, and in time arrived at the mouth of the Arkansas. First, they were greeted by the natives of this locality, as Marquette had before been greeted by them, with the booming of the war drum and the flourish of arms. The Virgin composed the difficulty in Marquette's case. The pipe of peace did the same office for La Salle. The white man and the red man struck hands and entertained each other during 3 days. Then, to the admiration of the savages, La Salle set up a cross with the arms of France on it, and took possession of the whole country for the king, the cool fashion of the time. While the priest piously consecrated the robbery with a hymn, the priest explained the mysteries of the faith by signs, for the saving of the savages, thus compensating them with possible possessions in heaven for the certain ones on earth which they had just been robbed of. And also, by signs, La Salle drew from these simple children of the forest acknowledgments of fealty to Louis the Putrid, over the water. Nobody smiled at these colossal ironies. These performances took place on the site of the future town of Napoleon, Arkansas, and there the first confiscation cross was raised on the banks of the great river. Marquette's and Joliet's voyage of discovery ended at the same spot, the site of the future town of Napoleon. When de Soto took his fleeting glimpse of the river, away back in the dim early days, he took it from that same spot, the site of the future town of Napoleon, Arkansas. Therefore, 3 out of the 4 memorable events connected with the discovery and exploration of the mighty river occurred by accident in one and the same place. It is a most curious distinction when one comes to look at it and think about it. France stole that vast country on that spot, the future Napoleon, and by Napoleon himself was to give the country back again. Make restitution, not to the owners but to their white American heirs. The voyagers journeyed on, touching here and there, past the sites since become historic of Vicksburg and Grand Gulf, and visited an imposing Indian monarch in the Teche country, whose capital city was a substantial one of sun-baked bricks mixed with straw, better houses than many that exist there now. The chief's house contained an audience room 40 feet square, and there he received Tonti in state, surrounded by 60 old men clothed in white cloaks. There was a temple in the town, with a mud wall about it ornamented with skulls of enemies sacrificed to the sun. The voyagers visited the Natchez Indians, near the site of the present city of that name, where they found a religious and political despotism, a privileged class descended from the sun, a temple and a sacred fire. It must have been like getting home again. It was home with an advantage, in fact, for it lacked Louis Roman XIV. A few more days swept swiftly by, and La Salle stood in the shadow of his confiscating cross, at the meeting of the waters from Delaware and from Itasca, and from the mountain ranges close upon the Pacific with the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, his task finished, his prodigy achieved. Mr. Parkman, in closing his fascinating narrative, thus sums up. On that day the realm of France received on parchment a stupendous accession, the fertile plains of Texas, the vast basin of the Mississippi from its frozen northern springs to the sultry borders of the Gulf, from the woody ridges of the Alleghanies to the bare peaks of the Rocky Mountains, a region of savannas and forests, sun-cracked deserts and grassy prairies, watered by 1,000 rivers, ranged by 1,000 warlike tribes, passed beneath the sceptre of the Sultan of Versailles, and all by virtue of a feeble human voice, inaudible at half a mile. Chapter 3. Frescoes from the Past. Apparently the river was ready for business now. But no, the distribution of a population along its banks was as calm and deliberate and time-devouring a process as the discovery and exploration had been. 70 years elapsed after the exploration before the river's borders had a white population worth considering, and nearly 50 more before the river had a commerce. Between La Salle's opening of the river and the time when it may be said to have become the vehicle of anything like a regular and active commerce, 7 sovereigns had occupied the throne of England. America had become an independent nation, Louis Roman XIV, and Louis Roman XV had rotted and died, the French monarchy had gone down in the red tempest of the Revolution, and Napoleon was a name that was beginning to be talked about. Truly, there were snails in those days. The river's earliest commerce was in great barges, keelboats, broadhorns. They floated and sailed from the upper rivers to New Orleans, changed cargoes there, and were tediously warped and poled back by hand. A voyage down and back sometimes occupied 9 months. In time this commerce increased until it gave employment to hordes of rough and hardy men, rude, uneducated, brave, suffering terrific hardships with sailor-like stoicism. Heavy drinkers, coarse frolickers in moral styes like the Natchez under the hill of that day, heavy fighters, reckless fellows, everyone, elephantinely jolly, foul-witted, profane, prodigal of their money, bankrupt at the end of the trip, fond of barbaric finery, prodigious braggarts. yet in the main honest, trustworthy, faithful to promises and duty, and often picturesquely magnanimous. By and by the steamboat intruded. Then for 15 or 20 years, these men continued to run their keelboats downstream, and the steamers did all of the upstream business, the keelboatmen selling their boats in New Orleans and returning home as deck passengers in the steamers. But after a while the steamboats so increased in number and in speed that they were able to absorb the entire commerce, and then keelboating died a permanent death. The keelboatman became a deckhand, or a mate, or a pilot on the steamer, and when steamer berths were not open to him, he took a berth on a Pittsburgh coal flat, or on a pine raft constructed in the forests up toward the sources of the Mississippi. In the heyday of the steamboating prosperity, the river from end to end was flaked with coal fleets and timber rafts, all managed by hand, and employing hosts of the rough characters whom I have been trying to describe. I remember the annual processions of mighty rafts that used to glide by Hannibal when I was a boy. An acre or so of white, sweet-smelling boards in each raft, a crew of 24 men or more, 3 or 4 wigwams scattered about the raft's vast level, space for storm quarters, and I remember the rude ways and the tremendous talk of their big crews, the ex-keelboatmen and their admiringly patterning successors, for we used to swim out a quarter or third of a mile and get on these rafts and have a ride. By way of illustrating keelboat talk and manners, and that now departed and hardly remembered raft life, I will throw in this place a chapter from a book which I have been working at, by fits and starts during the past 5 or 6 years, and may possibly finish in the course of 5 or 6 more. The book is a story which details some passages in the life of an ignorant village boy, Huck Finn, son of the town drunkard of my time out west there. He has run away from his persecuting father, and from a persecuting good widow who wishes to make a nice, truth-telling, respectable boy of him, and with him a slave of the widow's has also escaped. They have found a fragment of a lumber raft, it is high water and dead summer time, and are floating down the river by night, and hiding in the willows by day, bound for Cairo, whence the Negro will seek freedom in the heart of the Free States. But in a fog, they pass Cairo without knowing it. By and by they begin to suspect the truth, and Huck Finn is persuaded to end the dismal suspense by swimming down to a huge raft which they have seen in the distance ahead of them, creeping aboard under cover of the darkness, and gathering the needed information by eavesdropping. But you know a young person can't wait very well when he is impatient to find a thing out. We talked it over, and by Jim said it was such a black night now that it wouldn't be no risk to swim down to the big raft and crawl aboard and listen. They would talk about Cairo, because they would be calculating to go ashore there for a spree maybe, or anyway, they would send boats ashore to buy whiskey or fresh meat or something. Jim had a wonderful level head for a nigger. He could most always start a good plan when you wanted one. I stood up and shook my rags off and jumped into the river and struck out for the raft's light. By and by, when I got down nearly to her, I eased up and went slow and cautious, but everything was all right, nobody at the sweeps. So I swum down along the raft till I was most abreast the camp fire in the middle, then I crawled aboard and inched along and got in amongst some bundles of shingles on the weather side of the fire. There was 13 men there, they was the watch on deck of course, and a mighty rough-looking lot too. They had a jug and tin cups and they kept the jug moving. One man was singing, roaring you may say, and it wasn't a nice song for a parlour anyway. He roared through his nose and strung out the last word of every line very long. When he was done they all fetched a kind of Injun war whoop, and then another was sung. It begun. There was a woman in our toden did dwell. She loved her husband dearly, but another man twisty as weddle. Singing too, rilu, right too, rilu rile. She loved her husband dearly, but another man twist as weddle. And so on 14 verses. It was kind of poor, and when he was going to start on the next verse one of them said it was the tune the old cow died on, and another one said, "Oh, give us a rest," and another one told him to take a walk. They made fun of him till he got mad and jumped up and begun to cuss the crowd, and said he could lame any thief in the lot. They was all about to make a break for him, but the biggest man there jumped up and says, "Set where you are, gentlemen, leave him to me, he's my meat." Then he jumped up in the air 3 times and cracked his heels together every time. He flung off a buckskin coat that was all hung with fringes and says, "You lay thar till the chowin' up's done," and flung his hat down, which was all over ribbons, and says, "You lay thar till his sufferin's is over." Then he jumped up in the air and cracked his heels together again and shouted out, "Whoop, I'm the old original iron-jawed, brass-mounted, copper-bellied corpse-maker from the wilds of Arkansas. Look at me, I'm the man they call sudden death and general desolation, sired by a hurricane, damned by an earthquake, half-brother to the cholera, nearly related to the smallpox on the mother's side. Look at me, I take 19 alligators and a barrel of whiskey for breakfast when I'm in robust health, and a bushel of rattlesnakes and a dead body when I'm ailing. I split the everlasting rocks with my glance, and I squench the thunder when I speak. Whoop, stand back and give me room according to my strength. Blood's my natural drink, and the wails of the dying is music to my ear. Cast your eye on me, gentlemen, and lay low and hold your breath, for I'm about to turn myself loose." All the time he was getting this off, he was shaking his head and looking fierce, and kind of swelling around in a little circle, tucking up his wristbands, and now and then straightening up and beating his breast with his fist, saying, "Look at me, gentlemen." When he got through, he jumped up and cracked his heels together 3 times, and let off a roaring whoop. "I'm the bloodiest son of a wildcat that lives." Then the man that had started the row tilted his old slouch hat down over his right eye. Then he bent, stooping forward with his back sagged and his south end sticking out far, and his fists shoving out and drawing in front of him, and so went around in a little circle about 3 times, swelling himself up and breathing hard. Then he straightened and jumped up and cracked his heels together 3 times before he lit again. That made them cheer, and he begun to shout like this: "Whoop, bow your neck and spread, for the kingdom of sorrows a coming. Hold me down to the earth, for I feel my powers a working. Whoop, I'm a child of sin, don't let me get a start. Smoked glass here for all. Don't attempt to look at me with the naked eye, gentlemen. When I'm playful I use the meridians of longitude and parallels of latitude for a sen, and drag the Atlantic Ocean for whales. I scratch my head with the lightning and purr myself to sleep with the thunder. When I'm cold I boil the Gulf of Mexico and bathe in it. When I'm hot I fan myself with an equinoctial storm. When I'm thirsty I reach up and suck a cloud dry like a sponge. When I range the earth hungry, famine follows in my tracks. Whoop, bow your neck and spread. I put my hand on the sun's face and make it night in the earth. I bite a piece out of the moon and hurry the seasons. I shake myself and crumble the mountains. Contemplate me through leather, don't use the naked eye. I'm the man with a petrified heart and iron bowels. The massacre of isolated communities is the pastime of my idle moments. The destruction of nationalities the serious business of my life. The boundless vastness of the great American desert is my enclosed property, and I bury my dead on my own premises. He jumped up and cracked his heels together 3 times before he lit. They cheered him again, and as he come down he shouted out, "Whoop, bow your neck and spread, for the pet child of calamities are coming." Then the other one went to swelling around and blowing again. The first one, the one they called Bob. Next, the child of calamity chipped in again, bigger than ever. Then they both got at it at the same time, swelling round and round each other and punching their fists most into each other's faces, and whooping and jawing like Injuns. Then Bob called the child names, and the child called him names back again. Next, Bob called him a heap rougher names, and the child come back at him with the very worst kind of language. Next, Bob knocked the child's hat off, and the child picked it up and kicked Bob's ribbony hat about 6 foot. Bob went and got it and said, "Never mind, this going to be the last of this thing," because he was a man that never forgot and never forgive, and so the child better look out. For there was a time a-coming, just as sure as he was a living man, that he would have to answer to him with the best blood in his body. The child said no man was willinger than he was for that time to come, and he would give Bob fair warning now never to cross his path again, for he could never rest till he had waded in his blood, for such was his nature, though he was sparing him now on account of his family, if he had one. Both of them was edging away in different directions, growling and shaking their heads, and going on about what they was going to do, but a little black-whiskered chap skipped up and says, "Come back here, you couple of chicken-livered cowards, and I'll thrash the 2 of ye." And he done it too. He snatched them, he jerked them this way and that, he booted them around, he knocked them sprawling faster than they could get up. Why, it warn't 2 minutes till they begged like dogs, and how the other lot did yell and laugh and clap their hands all the way through and shout, "Sail in, corpse maker." Hi, at him again, child of calamity. Bully for you, little Davy. Well, it was a perfect powwow for a while. Bob and the child had red noses and black eyes when they got through. Little Davy made them own up that they were sneaks and cowards, and not fit to eat with a dog or drink with a nigger. Then Bob and the child shook hands with each other, very solemn, and said they had always respected each other and was willing to let bygones be bygones. So then they washed their faces in the river, And just then there was a loud order to stand by for a crossing, and some of them went forward to man the sweeps there, and the rest went aft to handle the after-sweeps. I laid still and waited for 15 minutes, and had a smoke out of a pipe that one of them left in reach. Then the crossing was finished, and they stumped back and had a drink around and went to talking and singing again. Next they got out an old fiddle, and one played and another patted juba, and the rest turned themselves loose on a regular old-fashioned keelboat breakdown. They couldn't keep that up very long without getting winded, so by and by they settled around the jug again. They sung Jolly, Jolly Raftman's The Life for Me, with a rousing chorus, and then they got to talking about differences betwixt hogs and their different kind of habits, and next about women and their different ways, and next about the best ways to put out houses that was afire, and next about what ought to be done with the Injuns, and next about what a king had to do and how much he got, and next about how to make cats fight, and next about what to do when a man has fits, and next about differences betwixt clear water rivers and muddy water ones. The man they called Ed said the muddy Mississippi water was wholesomer to drink than the clear water of the Ohio. He said if you let a pint of this yaller Mississippi water settle, you would have about a half to 3/4 of an inch of mud in the bottom, according to the stage of the river, and then it warn't no better than Ohio water. What you wanted to do was to keep it stirred up. And when the river was low, keep mud on hand to put in and thicken the water up the way it ought to be. The Child of Calamity said that was so. He said there was nutritiousness in the mud, and a man that drunk Mississippi water could grow corn in his stomach if he wanted to. He says, you look at the graveyards, that tells the tale. Trees won't grow worth chucks in a Cincinnati graveyard, but in a St. Louis graveyard they grow upwards of 800 foot high. It's all on account of the water the people drunk before they laid up. A Cincinnati corpse don't richen a soil any. And they talked about how Ohio water didn't like to mix with Mississippi water. Ed said if you take the Mississippi on a rise when the Ohio is low, you'll find a wide band of clear water all the way down the east side of the Mississippi for 100 miles or more, and the minute you get out 1/4 of a mile from shore and past the line, it is all thick and yaller the rest of the way across. Then they talked about how to keep tobacco from getting mouldy, and from that they went into ghosts and told about a lot that other folks had seen. But Ed says, why don't you tell something that you've seen yourselves? Now let me have a say. 5 years ago I was on a raft as big as this, and right along here it was a bright moonshiny night, and I was on watch and boss of the starboard or for'ard, and one of my pards was a man named Dick Albright, and he come along to where I was sitting for'ard, gaping and stretching he was, and stooped down on the edge of the raft and washed his face in the river, and come and sat down by me and got out his pipe and had just got it filled, when he looks up and says, why looky here, he says, ain't that Buck Miller's place over yonder in the bend? Yes, says I, it is. Why? He laid his pipe down and leant his head on his hand and says, I thought we'd be further down, I says. I thought it too when I went off watch. We were standing 6 hours on and 6 off, but the boys told me, I says, that the raft didn't seem to hardly move for the last hour, says I. Though she's a-slipping along all right now, says I. He give a kind of a groan and says, I've seed a raft act so before along here, he says. 'Pears to me the current has most quit above the head of this bend during the last 2 years, he says. Well, he raised up 2 or 3 times and looked away off and around on the water. That started me at it too. A body is always doing what he sees somebody else doing, though there mayn't be no sense in it. Pretty soon I see a black something floating on the water away off to starboard and quartering behind us. I see he was looking at it too, I says. What's that? He says, sort of pettish. 'Tain't nothing but an old empty barrel. An empty barrel, says I. Why, says I, a spyglass is a fool to your eyes. How can you tell it's an empty barrel? He says. I don't know, I reckon it ain't a barrel, but I thought it might be, says he. Yes, I says, so it might be, and it might be anything else too. A body can't tell nothing about it, such a distance as that, I says. We hadn't nothing else to do, so we kept on watching it. By and by I says, why looky here, Dick Albright, that thing's a-gaining on us, I believe. He never said nothing. The thing gained, and I judged it must be a dog that was about tired out. Well, we swung down into the crossing, and the thing floated across the bright streak of the moonshine, and by George it was barrel, says I. Dick Albright, what made you think that thing was a barrel when it was a half a mile off, says I, says he. I don't know, says I. You tell me, Dick Albright, he says. Well, I knowed it was a barrel, I've seen it before, lots has seen it, they says it's a haunted barrel. I called the rest of the watch and they come and stood there, and I told them what Dick said. It floated right along abreast now and didn't gain any more. It was about 20 foot off. Some was for having it aboard, but the rest didn't want to. Dick Albright said rafts that had fooled with it had got bad luck by it. The captain of the watch said he didn't believe in it. He said he reckoned the barrel gained on us because it was in a little better current than what we was. He said it would leave by and by. So then we went to talking about other things, and we had a song and then a breakdown, and after that the captain of the watch called for another song. But it was clouding up now, and the barrel stuck right thar in the same place, and the song didn't seem to have much warm-up to it somehow, and so they didn't finish it, and there weren't any cheers, but it sort of dropped flat, and nobody said anything for a minute. Then everybody tried to talk at once, and one chap got off a joke, but it warn't no use, they didn't laugh, and even the chap that made the joke didn't laugh at it, which ain't usual. We all just settled down glum, and watched the barrel and was wannessy and uncomfortable. Well, sir, it shut down black and still, and then the wind began to moan around, and next the lightning began to play and the thunder to grumble, and pretty soon there was a regular storm, and in the middle of it a man that was running aft stumbled and fell and sprained his ankle so that he had to lay up. This made the boys shake their heads, and every time the lightning come there was that barrel with the blue lights winking around it. We was always on the lookout for it, but by and by towards dawn she was gone. When the day come we couldn't see her anywhere, and we weren't sorry neither. But next night about 9:30, when there was songs and high jinks going on, here she comes again, and took her old roost on the starboard side. There weren't no more high jinks, everybody got solemn, nobody talked, you couldn't get anybody to do anything but set around moody and look at the barrel. It begun to cloud up again. When the watch changed, the off watch stayed up, stead of turning in. The storm ripped and roared around all night, and in the middle of it another man tripped and sprained his ankle and had to knock off. The barrel left towards day, and nobody see it go. Everybody was sober and down in the mouth all day. I don't mean the kind of sober that comes of leaving liquor alone, not that. They was quiet, but they all drunk more than usual, not together, but each man sidled off and took it private by himself. After dark the off-watch didn't turn in, nobody sung, nobody talked, the boys didn't scatter around neither, they sort of huddled together, for'ard, and for 2 hours they sat there perfectly still looking steady in the one direction and heaving a sigh once in a while. And then here comes the barrel again. She took up her old place. She stayed there all night, nobody turned in. The storm come on again after midnight, it got awful dark, the rain poured down, hail too, the thunder boomed and roared and bellowed, the wind blowed a hurricane, and the lightning spread over everything in big sheets of glare, and showed the whole raft as plain as day. And the river lashed up white as milk as far as you could see for miles, and there was that barrel jiggering along same as ever. The captain ordered the watch to man the after sweeps for a crossing, and nobody would go, no more sprained ankles for them, they said. They wouldn't even walk aft. Well then, just then the sky split wide open with a crash, and the lightning killed 2 men of the after watch and crippled 2 more. Crippled them how, says you? Why, sprained their ankles. The barrel left in the dark betwixt lightnings towards dawn. Well, not a body eat a bite at breakfast that morning. After that the men loafed around in 2s and 3s and talked low together, but none of them herded with Dick Albright. They all give him the cold shake. If he come around where any of the men was, they split up and sidled away. They wouldn't man the sweeps with him. The captain had all the skiffs hauled up on the raft alongside of his wigwam, and wouldn't let the dead men be took ashore to be planted. He didn't believe a man that got ashore would come back, and he was right. After night come you could see pretty plain that there was going to be trouble if that barrel come again. There was such a muttering going on. A good many wanted to kill Dick Albright, because he'd seen the barrel on other trips and that had an ugly look. Some wanted to put him ashore. Some said, let's all go ashore in a pile if the barrel comes again.